This is my most favorite quote. I've had more trouble with myself than with any other man I've ever met. If we replace the word man with person, how many of you can relate to that quote? This quote is so important to me that I have it taped above my computer monitor so that I can see it every day. Why is it that important? Because I need a daily reminder of the trouble I can get myself into if I'm not paying attention to my blind spots and the triggers that activate those blind spots and cause my destructive behavior. As an example of that trouble, on November 29, 1995, I was standing in front of a federal court judge who was getting ready to sentence me to incarceration in a federal prison. We're going to return to that judge in a few moments. My name is Paul Glover, and the idea that I have that's worth spreading is everyone needs a fool in their life. Now, I realize that this requires some explanation, especially the definition of a fool. The concept of the fool originated in the Middle Ages, when kings were appointed by divine right. This meant that kings were appointed by God. And because God was infallible, it made the king infallible. Therefore, anyone who challenged the king, their bad behavior or bad decision, committed the crime of heresy. And heresy was punishable by death. But even though everyone knew that God was infallible, they also knew the king was not. The king was a human being who engaged in bad behavior and made bad decisions. The conundrum was how to tell the king that he was wrong and not get your head cut off. The solution was the fool. Now, when we think about the fool, this is the image that we see. We believe the fool was an entertainer who sat at the foot of the king's throne, jumped up occasionally, did a little dance, sang a song, told jokes to the king, all to make him laugh. The reality is, the real role of the fool was as a trusted advisor to the king. He knew the king's blind spots and the triggers that could occur that would cause the king to make bad decisions and engage in bad behavior. And he had permission to tell the king when he was wrong. And I believe that that fool counterbalanced the divine right of kings for 1,500 years. And I also believe that we need modern-day fools in our lives as much as kings needed fools in theirs. The modern-day fool is a person we trust and respect, who can see our blind spots and the triggers that activate our bad behavior, and have the psychological safety and care enough about us to give us the truth about our bad behavior and our bad decisions. On January 19th, I woke up as a successful trial lawyer. When I went to bed, I'd been indicted by a federal grand jury on 33 counts of taking kickbacks and bribes and threatening government witnesses. 10 months and 2 trials later, I was standing in front of that federal court judge I mentioned earlier, who sentenced me to 7 years of incarceration in a federal penitentiary. I spent the first 2 years of my incarceration struggling with the guilt and grief that my behavior had caused my family and others. When I went to prison, I left my family financially destitute. I had spent all of our savings, my 2 sons' college education funds, and put a mortgage on our home, all in the failed attempt to not go to jail for the crimes that I'd committed. But even worse than that was the emotional devastation my family had to endure when they and everyone they knew realized that I was a criminal. The fact that my family survived my destructive behavior is a miracle. Prison forced me to realize that if I didn't change, I was going to lose my family for good. But even though I knew I'd committed destructive behavior, I couldn't understand why. What caused me to engage in the behavior that put me in prison, cost me my career, and caused so much pain to those that I loved? It was only when I read about blind spots and the role of the medieval fool that I began to understand what I needed. And what I needed was a modern-day fool. Because while I certainly wasn't a king, I saw the role that the fool played for the king and how valuable it was, and I needed that. And I asked the person I had damaged the most, my wife Debbie, if she would be my fool. For 26 years, she's occupied that space. And every day, she helps me to remember to be a better person, to recognize those blind spots, and not allow those triggers, the words and actions that other people do, to cause me to engage in destructive behavior. Now, I realize that most people will not engage in the same level of bad behavior that I did. But everyone has blind spots that we cannot see. And that means we do not know the impact that those blind spots and the behavior that we engage in when those blind spots are activated by a trigger, someone's actions, someone's words. We don't see that behavior, that destructive behavior, because it ripples out from us. We need someone who can show us those blind spots. Because those blind spots are so deeply embedded in our personality, they cannot be eliminated. But their negative impact can be controlled when we have the assistance of a fool in our life who can give us the gift of truth about us and our behavior. Now, I hope some of you are thinking, I realize I could use a fool in my life. But what do I do next? How do I find a fool? Fortunately, our fools are all around us. But like the medieval fools, they're disguised. They're disguised as our teachers, as our co-workers, as our coaches, as our mentors, as our family members, and as our friends. And the next question is, well, what do you do after you've recognized a potential fool? And the next thing you do is you ask yourself a question. Are you willing to commit to the hard work necessary to make the changes that will make you a better person based on the gift of truth, the information that your fool is going to give you? Because this is a difficult commitment to make. None of us like to be told about our bad behavior and the bad decisions we make. But that's a part of the process that you have to engage in if, in fact, you've made the decision to move from the person you are to the person you want to be. Only then, when you've answered that question in the affirmative, do you have the right to ask someone to become your fool. Because that person that you ask is going to know you well enough, know your blind spots and your reactions when you are told you're engaged in bad behavior or making a bad decision. And they're going to be very leery about performing the role of a fool. So you have to then give them permission. Tell them what you're asking them to do for you and how important it is for you, and then you give them permission to tell you about you, to give you the gift of truth about you. When I first asked my wife to become my fool, she said no. We'd been married 10 years. She knew enough about me and my personality to know that I would react adversely to being told I was wrong, to being told that I'd made a bad decision, to being told that I was engaged in bad behavior. I had to convince her that I knew that if I didn't listen to her, if I did not accept her gift of truth, I was going to lose my family. And as with the medieval fool, I had to create the psychological safety for her that allowed her to perform the role of a fool. You're going to have to do the same thing when you've found your potential fool. You're going to have to convince them that you're committed to change, and then you're going to have to tell them that they're going to have permission and the psychological safety to give you that gift of truth. And when they give it to you, you have to listen. Do you know how difficult that is when you're hearing someone you love tell you how bad your behavior has been? Even when you recognize the need to change, you still don't like to hear it. You have to actively listen. You have to dig deeper. You have to ask for more examples. You have to take a breath and not speak. And you cannot become defensive, because the first time you are defensive with your fool will be the last time they give you the gift of truth. They don't want the abuse. And once they see it coming, they're going to shut down. They're going to leave you. Once they've given you this gift of truth, you must thank them. You must tell them how grateful you are that they picked up this burden, that they engaged in this activity, this very hard activity, a very distasteful activity, because it shows how much they care about you. And you must tell them how valuable they are, and how you want them to remain in your life, and how you want them to continue to be a fool and give you their gift of truth. Then you must reflect. Because without reflection, the information your fool gives you is without value. You have to think about what you've been told, and then you must create an action plan. You must put in that action plan the steps you're going to take to change, to be a better person, to be a better you. And once that action's planned in place, you can then have another discussion with your fool, because you will need support. And who better to give you that support than the person who gave you the gift of truth? I can only tell you that if I'd had a fool in my life before 1995 to tell me that the activities I was engaged in, the decisions I was making, the people I was associating with, were going to create the destructive behavior that would harm the people that I loved, I would not have been standing in front of that federal court judge. I would not have gone to prison for 7 years. I can only tell you that if you don't believe you need a fool in your life, I believe that you have the biggest blind spot of all. Finally, when you have been blessed with having a fool in your life, you have an obligation. That obligation is you need to become a fool for someone you care about, because everyone needs a fool in their life. Thank you.